Molly Straub's middle school journal comes to an abrupt end on Tuesday, May 6th, less than 3 weeks into the 100-year flood.
Do you think this giant wall of water is gonna come and take out your whole house?
Her first mention of the waters is almost a month earlier, on Thursday, April 17th. The next day, Molly notes briefly, her entire neighborhood is to be evacuated.
We turned the radio on and they were screaming on the radio that the dike had broke and everyone needed to go. Get out, get out. The water's coming, get out.
For anyone living along the usually dormant Red River, the warnings are inescapable. A punishing record flood is coming.
We were acutely aware that we were facing a crisis, and it was going to take extraordinary efforts. Simply couldn't hold back that volume of water.
Just 2 blocks from the Straub's house, a thin wall of hastily assembled sandbags stands as the last line of defense against the frigid waters.
It was just sheer panic. Sirens were blaring, and the National Guard was driving down the street, screaming on megaphones, everybody get out. It was just a cluster of chaos. People were running with TVs, and others were trying to get in to get their pets, and others were trying to get out to get their kids.
Like the rest of the residents of this small North Dakota city, Molly and her mother had expected to beat back the Red River, as they had the year before, and the year before that. But these waters are different, hostile, and relentless.
This was extraordinary. We saw the face of God right there.
With nowhere else to go, water begins filling the low-lying areas, forcing entire neighborhoods underwater in just a matter of hours.
There's 50,000 people in Grand Forks that have now been evacuated, and they're all looking for a place.
It's an unparalleled disaster, triggering the United States' largest mass evacuation since the Civil War. And Molly and her family need to escape the city by any means possible. Any romantic notions of winter end well before trekking this deep into the Midwest. The border separating North Dakota and Minnesota is some of the harshest territory in America. Nowhere else in the lower 48 states is so prone to blizzards. But another threat looms. That vicious, snarling northern winds and biting cold are just the beginning.
Grand Forks is necessary. There has to be a city here. Grand Forks is at the confluence of 2 rivers.
America's restless westward expansion throughout the 1800s came with profound costs. North Dakota's abundant swaths of flat, fertile land urged farmers to brave deeper and deeper into the plains. These bonanza farms increased the state's population nearly 75 times over between 1870 and 1890.
In the age of water traffic, Grand Forks was like a crossroads, a good place to build a town.
It became a transportation hub very early. It was an important locus of the fur trade, even though they knew when they put it here that there were going to be flooding problems.
Grand Forks, the oldest major city in the sparsely populated Dakotas, is among the coldest habitable places on Earth.
Our name was originally La Grande Fourche, which means Grand Forks in French, where other towns in North Dakota have been named by the railroads because they controlled the state for so long. Grand Forks already had a name, and we got to keep it.
Grand Forks was founded in 1874, when a steamboat crew became trapped in the frozen Red River. The city quickly earned an outsized reputation of crowded saloons, brothels, gambling houses, and rickety log buildings. In its early winters, mail had to be taken in and out of town by dock teams.
Winter was a factor where rivers come together like St. Louis, like St. Paul. Towns were built. That was the way it was in the age of river transportation.
Winding more than 500 miles and forming a crooked natural border between states, the gnarled Red River carves a vital industrial artery.
The slope of the main Red River is like about a foot per mile along the main channel. That's not much.
With its brutal winter freezing, followed by punishing spring floods, the northern flowing Red River snakes through Grand Forks in North Dakota and its sister city, East Grand Forks in Minnesota. Together, they are known as the Grand Cities. It only took a few years for the untamed Midwest to push back against the pioneer incursion.
1896-97 was a winter that was a lot like 1996 and 1997. Trains that were out on the prairie were buried in the snow. These poor people were marooned until the railroad could track them down and dig them out.
A then record 1897 Red River flood topped the 50-foot mark. The resulting overland flooding reached deep into both states, devastating the fledgling Grand Cities. Available trains had to be parked on the railway bridge to prevent the river from washing it away.
It's so flat, people have said that, well, if you take a tabletop and scratch in there with your fingernail and then pour water in it, that's like the river trying to flow down that flat terrain. And it's not too far off of an exaggeration.
The record flood is said to have made a lake 30 miles wide and 150 miles long in the Red River Valley. Historians called it a 100-year flood. But those waters didn't concern everybody.
Grand Forks is surrounded by flatlands and no trees and a lot of barren fields, and all of a sudden it's 60-mile-an-hour winds. "40 below" is kind of average.
A Midwest native from a tiny Minnesota town, Kelly Straub believed a move to Grand Forks in 1980 would finally allow her to start a family. A young but profoundly timid mother, she grew tired of being rootless and bouncing between temporary apartments.
I knew the minute I saw the house that it was going to be mine, it was going to be ours, and we bought it.
We lived in the Lincoln Drive area, so we were kind of away from everything. It's your own little bowl down in the far end of the town.
It needed so much care and so much TLC, and I think that was the first time I think I ever just really felt comfortable. Not just the house, but just where I was in life in general. Lincoln Park, it was our own little community. You could say we're having a tea party in an hour, and all the little girls in the neighborhood would race home and put on something fancy and come over and have, tea and cookies. My kids are my life, they are.
Towering less than a block away, huge earthen dikes, built decades earlier, stood silent watch over Kelly's family and the rest of the Lincoln Park neighborhood. These dikes were topped with sandbags to withstand waters up to 52 feet. 1897's high water mark of 50.2 feet, which nearly leveled the Grand Cities, was considered impossibly extreme in modern times.
The Red River Valley is actually a dish. The sides of the valley drain into the valley, and they drain into the valley more rapidly because there is a downslope.
History books reveal dozens of earlier floods, forcing hundreds of families from the Central Park, Lincoln Drive, and Riverside neighborhoods. A near miss in 1979 was still all too fresh in residents' memories.
When it warmed up, it just all melted at once. It just overwhelmed the town.
The flooding followed an all too familiar pattern in the Red River Valley. Heavy snowfall, followed by rapidly rising spring temperatures that give way to waters that overwhelm the riverbanks.
A lot of people are here in 79, we're still here in 97. We found a lot of our weaknesses. The coordination just wasn't there, and we didn't know what to expect from day to day.
The fall of 79, we had just bought a home that was right down by the Red River.
Just over the bridge in East Grand Forks, the Stennis family was just getting their start, like Kelly. A soldier turned family man, Greg was an owner of Whitey's, a legendary downtown hangout and former speakeasy.
It's just like having a party at your house. Heck, we had 60 employees or more.
As Stennis once told a reporter, East Grand Forks always had a reputation for being kind of naughty. The Red River, however, always threatened the business and Greg's home. Like dozens of other volunteers, Greg and Andrea took shifts, inspecting the tops of the dikes each spring, walking for hours in the cold and dark, armed only with flashlights while searching for any hint of leaks.
We'd team up together and walk together. You know, you take a shift in the middle of the night, which you normally wouldn't be even up, but now you're out helping the communities. It felt good. It felt good to do that.
"1997 would end up being a year unlike any other in memory. For Kelly, her family, and the entire community. An early and punishing mid-November blizzard left more than a foot of snow behind. One fatigued resident told the local newspaper, "We've already had a month of January, and January isn't even here yet."
I wondered what in the devil I'd gotten myself into.
This was the year Kim Porter joined the history department at the University of North Dakota.
It was a bitter winter. There was snow, and more snow. The local newspaper started naming the blizzards like other folks name hurricanes, and I believe we were into the H.
The name seemed almost quaint at first. Andy, then Doris, then Elmo. But the snow kept coming. More than a half dozen storms blanketed Grand Forks that winter, collectively dumping nearly 100 inches of snow.
I think we're kind of hardy people here. You had snowbanks on the corners that were double the height of your car.
Then on April 4th came Hannah. 3 increasingly cruel days of cold ice and snow. The largest blizzard the region had seen in more than 50 years. The storm shuttered roads, splintered power lines, and crippled the already strained power grid. Residents went up to a week without electricity. Kelly knew she couldn't stay put.
The power had been knocked out, I think, for 3 days. We had a girlfriend that lived 5 blocks up. They had a wood-burning fireplace. And so the water in the glasses were freezing, and we were bundled, and we finally just took together with scarves, and we trekked the 5 blocks up to make sure none of us got lost, and we stayed there. All of that just builds up. I mean, the ice just keeps building and building and building and building. We lived 2 blocks from the school, and you couldn't even get them to school.
I went to Goodwill and picked up the ugliest, heaviest coat I could find. I referred to it for years as the dead man's coat because obviously it had not been donated by any living person.
Each year represents a delicate and uneasy dance for residents along the river.
We're basically piling up snow, and that snow is going to be here until the spring thaw.
The National Weather Service only makes extremely educated guesses. Their best guess for the Red River in 1997? A crest of 49 feet, based off of 1979's record flood. Inconvenient, but certainly not insurmountable for Grand Forks. Their model didn't include the river's level from 100 years earlier. when unreliable records claimed it crested over 50 feet.
When you have a very intense winter, then throw in a big ice storm or something, and you're taking down the power structure, taking down we're losing information off of river gauges and off of those sensor sets.
What forecasters didn't want to do was panic residents or city governments. Too high of a prediction could incur unnecessary precautions and crippling costs. Too low of a prediction, and the results could be tragic.
We have to protect ourselves because if one of those homes fails, it hits the rest of the city.
On April 3rd, just as the Red River hit the initial flood stage of 28 feet, residents were filling sandbags to top the dikes. For high schoolers, this back-breaking labor at Sandbag Central was a venerable rite of passage.
They'd come down the street with a flatbed truck full of sandbags and drop them off out in front of the house, wherever they were working on the dike. A forklift would go from the street with the sandbags to get it closer to the dike. People just would pass the sandbags along till they got to the dike and build it up.
The school buses full of young high school age kids come in here and put in a day's work and ride home and come back the next day and do it again.
A hodgepodge of dikes, levees, dams, and coulees stood ready to defend Grand Forks and its newly elected mayor, Pat Owens.
Together, we will all pull out of this, and our city will be stronger.
But now city officials worried this system might not be enough to withstand the inevitable rush of water. By April 14th, the river had already swollen to over 44 feet, with no signs of slowing down.
I don't want to see those dikes sitting there with water getting within 6 inches or a foot.
When you're on top of those levees and you see the massive amount of water that's flowing through there and the forces, it gives you a total respect for Mother Nature and what's happening.
Everybody had felt a great responsibility to try and not just protect your home or the neighbor's home, but the city itself.
But as the waters loomed, supplies were at a premium.
We were working night and day, and finally we had even given people authorization to just go into the parks and start digging up and getting dirt to raise levees.
Sand couldn't be bagged fast enough. Heavy machinery pushed mounds of earth into a crude flood wall. But even that wasn't enough to hold back the deluge.
The terrain in Grand Forks, of course, is awfully flat. You raise your levees, sandbags or clay adjacent to the river, and at some point in time, it has to match back into high ground, and there is no high ground to match into anymore.
Certainly that last blizzard convinced all of us that this was extraordinary. Simply couldn't hold back that volume of water.
Before sunrise on Friday, April 18th, came the moment residents feared. Despite more than a month of tireless and backbreaking efforts by an entire community, floodwaters spilled over the tops of sandbags. With nowhere else to go, water filled the low-lying areas near the river like a bowl.
The water started overtopping the levees, which became a domino effect for the rest of the city.
We're going to make every effort we can to make sure that the Kennedy Bridge stays open. Because we're going to be very, very close to having that, at least the approaches to that, underwater. We know that the Sorley Bridge and the Point Bridge will be closed.
Lincoln Drive was the first bastion to fail, as water spilled onto a golf course. Less than 2 hours later, water was spotted in the Riverside neighborhood, then in Central Park. The swollen Red River was now up to 51.5 feet, with no signs of slowing.
We were getting updates, and they kept increasing it by half foot or a foot, and it was just like, wow, what's the top end going to be?
What had once been viewed as an annual inconvenience was now a full-on disaster. Mayor Pat Owens told residents It's time to leave Grand Forks.
It was early dawn. You could see people, and a guy is driving through in a large military vehicle saying, "You must evacuate, you must evacuate."
We're going to ask the people at about 47 feet to evacuate there because we're concerned about their safety.
The roads out of town were quickly overrun with traffic. Families swarmed a makeshift homeless shelter at the Grand Forks Air Force Base, where thousands of cots were hastily assembled for refugees in a converted F-16 hangar.
I don't think anybody, including ourselves, knew exactly where it was going to come next.
Slowly, sirens sounded evacuation alarms throughout the city. The low, spinning growl gave way to a deafening scream as the waters advanced. The waiting game for Kelly Straub and her family was over. Now, she told her children, was not the time to fight. This was the time to run.
Once the sirens hit and they are banging on doors saying, "Get out," then you get out. It's so chaotic that you're just trying to slow yourself down and think through the process.
Down the street, the echo of the sirens ricocheted off the windows at her daughter's middle school.
I was horrified because I was only 2 blocks from my daughter and I couldn't get her. You couldn't drive. It was just a cluster of chaos because we had been told for a month, 49 feet, we're good. We're good up to 49 feet, 49 feet, no big, 49 feet, unless the dike breaks, 49 feet. Anybody in a position that knew it was going to get worse should have just laid it out on the line and said, okay, here's the possibility.
By noon, the river crept over 52 feet, more than half a foot higher than it had been at dawn. Meanwhile, in East Grand Forks, officials spotted the first break in the dikes near Folsom Park.
The sirens started to go off, and they said, "The war's over. Get out of here. We're evacuating."
We had a change of clothes, thinking if we're evacuated, we'd probably be gone for just a day or two.
They had told us we should put a white rag, a white towel on the front porch to let people know that the house was empty. And if you needed help, you should put a colored one that would catch people's attention. And I think maybe that might have been the absolute moment that I knew this was a big one.
Everyone living in this neighborhood, you need to evacuate. You need to evacuate this area.
We were about 2.5 blocks from the dike itself. We were surrounded by the dike. It's like a horseshoe. Your first thought is a massive wall of water, like in the movies, is just gonna come pouring at you. But the reality was it had flooded up here, and then it was spinning around, and then it finally just filled us up.
It's one of the major disasters of our time, Grand Forks Mayor Pat Owens told CNN. Just 12 hours after water was first spotted on Lincoln Drive, the entire neighborhood was now underwater.
The kids are now put in a position. They're going to lose their home. Everything they own. They're going to lose their neighborhood. They're going to lose their elementary school. They're going to lose friends that they will never see again. They're losing everything. That pillow and that blanket and that doll is what they have, period.
We fought the fight just like we always did. We had sandbag dikes right out our back door. It was just the flood of the century, so we held it back as long as we could.
At 4 p.m., the point in East Grand Forks became the flood's next victim. Among the growing list of casualties, Mayor Owens' own childhood farm. As I talk to you this morning, my own home is going under, Owens said. Now, I'm in the same bucket with the rest of you. All three bridges out of town quickly followed. By Friday night, Sherlock Park, the neighborhood Greg and Andrea Stennis called home, was overtaken by the Red River. Water threaded the downtown streets, choking emergency travel, except by boat. But that was among the least of Grand Forks' growing list of concerns. The city's water treatment plant now strained under the rush of floodwater. Sewer backups spilled into city streets. Prisoners jailed at the downtown police station were bused to a nearby church.
It was just like a standstill. There were just cars and people and chaos. I mean, you could not move. You could not get anywhere.
And as night fell, another updated prediction from the National Weather Service called for the Savage River to crest at 54 feet. Their water gauges had stopped sending updates altogether.
What time today did people realize that they couldn't win the battle?
As they started telling us the crest was going to be 53, it went to 53 and a half, and when they said 54, we just all sort of looked at each other and knew that with the resources we had that we could not accomplish that. And at that point, we thought more of evacuation in an orderly manner or whatever we had to do.
East Grand Forks Mayor Lynn Stouse echoed many residents' frustrations with the National Weather Service. They missed it, he said. They blew it big.
That was probably the most scared I've ever been. There's helicopters above you and you don't know what's going on.
As mayor of East Grand Forks, I'm asking for mandatory evacuation of East Grand Forks for a period of at least 5 days. We've put up a good fight, but we couldn't quite make it. And for your own safety, I'm asking you to leave the city and come back when things are safe.
There's some current here. Water rushing over the dike. I don't know if you can hear it, but as we get closer to the channel, the roar of the river is rising. Just to give you an idea that the river, even though it looks smooth here where we are, still a fierce current out there. And it gets worse from here.
By the next morning, more than 4 feet of water flooded downtown streets, making it even with the river.
There's a real strong smell of diesel fuel here. And you can see as the oil goes by, there's a lot of it.
75% of the city was flooded, including the water treatment plant. Ken Vane told reporters there are about 11 million gallons of purified water in the city's reserves. Once that water runs out, the city would be left with nothing to drink. The plant wouldn't even make it through to the morning. Despite the rush of water, it would be weeks before any of it would be safe to drink. All efforts to contain the flooding were halted. There was no more clay to be mined for sandbags or for temporary earth walls. All residents could do now was flee or wait out the waters. From a city few people had heard of came an evacuation, the scale of which had been unseen in America in more than a century. Across the river, the vast majority of East Grand Forks was already submerged. The still water silence, said one firefighter, was the scariest thing of all. The true scope of the tragedy now came into focus. 2 small American cities had quickly become the epicenter of tragedy. The Red River had won.
Just because there's water in the streets doesn't mean that there's not going to be fires.
As Greg and Andrea Stennis fled East Grand Forks, they noticed a faint column of smoke on the horizon. and snapped this picture. With neck-deep water winding through the downtown streets, rescuers struggled with limited mobility.
They didn't know anything about it?
Nope. I'm sure everybody's out of there.
The first fire broke out at the security building, home of the Grand Forks Herald, the city's paper of record. It wasn't long before the 25-foot flames reached into adjacent buildings. Firefighters, already chilled from wading in the icy water and fraught with worry about their own homes, turned the floodwaters back onto the buildings. Helicopters and airplanes doused Grand Forks from the air. But it was of little use. The downtown burned throughout the night, despite the standing water.
Okay, we're going to bring you a little more up to speed on the fire, which is the greatest concern right now. It's not totally under control at this time. We do have a great risk of life down there. We are staging helicopters for helicopter rescues. These people, if they can't reach us by some cellular phone or whatever, need to hang a sheet out the window, get on some place where they can notify these helicopters and wave an item. They need to turn electrical power off. They need to turn the gas off, or we're going to have other explosions, electrical problems down there. This is a very, very serious situation.
We don't know how it started. Much of downtown Grand Forks was connected with a steam tunnel system. They sucked fire through them. It took out essentially 2 city blocks. If they had been freestanding buildings, each of them, the damage might not have been quite so complete.
There were a lot of people who came to the conclusion that this is my job. And my job is with my city, particularly if my wife and kids or husband and kids are safe. There were some true heroes that made Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and just kept on making those plans until the water started to recede. The people who stick at their job because it is their job, and they don't really think of themselves as heroes. They think of themselves as doing what they are supposed to do.
You said there's 4 people in this building?
It wasn't before the flood, and it wasn't actually even the flood that destroyed people. It was just the aftermath that destroyed people.
If you could see this desk, if we got a really wide shot of this desk, you would see. I mean, this is just a portion of all of the announcements that we've got in. People who are opening up their homes to the flood victims in the greater Grand Forks area.
Jerry Roach has room for 4 people in Mackinac, 701-594-8166.
Deborah Samuelson, call your mother at 594-5652. She needs to hear from you.
Vernon Cole, K-O-E-L, from Williams, has room for 6.
A resident in Greenbush, Minnesota is currently taking in cats.
Residents are asked to bring their pet carriers to Northland Community College by 6 o'clock tonight for a pet evac.
Michigan, North Dakota is opening its Civic Center to shelter Grand Forks flood victims.
There is a shelter in Hillsboro that can hold 300 to 400 people. Pets are accepted. Daycare also be available.
Here's the headlines, huh? And what do we say? No kidding. Flood homes
needs an S on it.
Okay, flood hits home, huh? So we got the newspaper, we got the water, we got the firemen, we got the pontoon.
The Red River finally crested on April 21st, 4 days after evacuations began. Its reach would top out just shy of 54.5 feet. When Grand Forks Mayor Pat Owens surveyed the damage, she couldn't disguise her pain. "I felt like a fist hit me," she told one reporter. "You read in the Bible, the end of the world? That's how it felt." The flooding fanned out for more than 3 miles from the river, partially contained by a last-ditch earthen dike down the middle of Washington Street, about a mile from the river. In an effort to save the rest of the city, riverside neighborhoods had been effectively walled in.
You just can't run from it. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to go away.
Trying to show how much the water's gone down. The amount of debris here is just incredible. All sorts of garbage washed up.
Inch by slow inch, the water finally started to retreat, nearly a week after the flood began. Most residents wouldn't be allowed back into their homes for more than a month.
It was awful. There's 50,000 people in Grand Forks that have now been evacuated, and they're all looking for a place. We moved 8 times in 6 weeks, and I finally said, I'm going home.
Summoning more courage than she'd ever needed, Kelly began a long trek home. She wanted to provide a strong example for her family. Kelly refused to be bested by the Red River.
They say people have a fight or flight, and I guess I was just a fighter and thought it was best to teach them the same. They didn't know what was going on with their stuff. They didn't know what was going on with their pets. They didn't know what was going on with the house.
First time I've ever touched one of those. Okay, we're standing outside of River Heights School, and I'm getting ready to go inside. Okay, the sound you hear is the fire alarm. I'll show you how high the water is. Inside the bathroom, this will give you an idea.
After spending weeks wandering and homeless, Kelly and her daughters returned to their neighborhood through the armed National Guard checkpoints, only to find their home a rotting shell of its former self.
We finally get down to our street and we couldn't park on the street. Everything's covered in mud. And I remember standing across the street in the driveway looking at our house and just thinking, oh my God, that's our house. You can see the mud levels on the house where the water sat.
Kelly, now defiant, staked her claim against the river by pitching a tent on her front lawn.
Our deck in the back of the house had already floated to the front of the house, so we already had a nice base.
The family watched as entire neighborhoods had to be gutted, house by house, room by room.
You couldn't get in your house. I mean, all of the furniture, was just everywhere. The smell is just one you will never forget. It is so awful. It is rotting food and infected fish and, you know what I mean? It's just that ick smell. But then all of a sudden I hit the kitchen and my plants had just exploded. It's just this mucky, dirty, smelly, icky, and then this huge, lush plant.
The rank smell of the river mud, rotting garbage, and hundreds of gallons of bleach hung heavy in the air for a month as the river slowly receded.
I found a red shoe on the ceiling fan in my bedroom. It would have had to float through the basement, up the steps, through the kitchen, through the dining room, down the hallway, into my bedroom, and land on the ceiling fan. I don't own a red shoe. Everything had shifted 2 blocks up. The red shoe had belonged to somebody 2 blocks down that came to my house. The lawn chair that was hooked to the back of my house was 2 blocks up. So it was like everything was just shifted in a big circle 2 blocks.
Check this out. Down there is a car. To think that we're driving down city street and our heads are taller than the tops of the doors. A pretty strong smell of fuel here, isn't it?
In East Grand Forks, the numbers were staggering. Only 8 homes remained untouched by the Red River. 500 buildings were condemned.
There is a lot of stuff in this water. It doesn't smell real safe.
We couldn't walk on the dike to get back to our house. So that was a shock to see. It was horrible. Everyone was like, yeah, probably in shock, seeing the devastation of it all.
Andrea and Greg were jolted for a second time, finding that Whitey's had borne the full brunt of the Red's ferociousness, exacting a devastating toll financially and emotionally.
You gotta muck the place out and try to salvage what you can and figure out a game plan. It was exhilarating, frankly, just to fight back.
You don't really believe that this just happened to your home and your town and your business. But because everybody else was doing it too, at least you didn't feel like you were alone.
How do you get all those services back on so people can get in and let them get access to their property? Everybody is out of town, they want to get back to their homes. There's so much debris and contamination and damage that's been done. There's no street lights, there's no signal lights, there's no traffic control, and people's homes are still very dangerous.
It taught an awful lot of kids that whether you lost your stuffed animal or not, you're still gonna sleep, and you're still gonna eat, and you're still gonna get up. They would fight over a number 2 pencil, like cats and dogs. But if one of them was struggling, they would give their blanket, their prized possession, and their dolls to each other, and they would cuddle each other. And I think they just learned how to cope. And that was when I really knew I was making the right decision.
FEMA shipped in temporary housing for thousands of locals. Organized into makeshift neighborhoods called Femaville, the flimsy trailers, meant for short-term use, became long-term homes for many residents. Kelly parked hers in the driveway. Her family wasn't going anywhere.
I wasn't leaving, and they knew I wasn't leaving. We would just use it to shower or go to the bathroom.
One by one, the surrounding houses were condemned and torn down. Before long, Kelly's house was the only one still standing on Lincoln Drive.
We opened the whole bottom section for all the neighborhood kids that were coming back. And we hit all the distribution centers and got as many paints and paintbrushes and colors and anything we could get. And I would draw huge murals on the wall, like a giant coloring book. And while their parents were cleaning out their houses, they would all just veg in the house and paint and color and write things, and it kept them busy. Losing your best stuffed animal that you've had since a baby and you've slept with for the past 10 years that nobody knows you still sleep with anymore is pretty traumatic for them. But as an adult, they don't want to hear about it.
Kelly stubbornly pressed on at her property for 3 years before finally chalking it up as a loss to the mighty flood. Kelly, as she later told a writer, had always felt like a doormat when she moved to Grand Forks. The waters, however, turned her into a bitch.
I don't regret the flood. I don't regret anything I did during the flood. I found that it made me a stronger person. It made my kids stronger.
More than 90% of Grand Forks' 50,000 residents were evacuated, in the country's largest mass evacuation since the 1860s. 11 downtown buildings across 3 blocks burned in less than 12 hours. It would take nearly a week for the river to loosen its grip and begin to recede. As one resident remembered, time becomes endless. And through all of it, I remember the overwhelming cold and bone-deep exhaustion. Resentment toward the National Weather Service bubbled up to the surface. Signs and shirts reading, 49 feet my ass, became ubiquitous in Grand Forks for months. But in spite of all the pain and all the challenges, the water didn't claim a single life.
Nobody died in the flood. That may be true, but people were aged tremendously.
In Grand Forks, 450 homes had to be demolished. More than 9,000 others were damaged. Entire neighborhoods, Lincoln Drive, Riverside, Central Park, all washed away. The financial toll of the flood could be calculated. More than $1.5 billion. The emotional toll was beyond measure.
This disaster was unique in the sense that the responders themselves, such as myself, had all lost their homes. It's not like we were going to have a home to go to at the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of the month. And we had lost our churches and our schools and our grocery stores and everything. It's still overwhelming emotionally.
I've been hurt. I've been damaged. People wanted to be made whole. And there wasn't going to be a made whole.
In East Grand Forks, the Stennis family knew they couldn't stay near the surging river any longer.
Restaurant bar business on the east side has been flourishing through all the way through Prohibition and through the 40s, and we've never had a drop of water in there, and all of a sudden we're up to our eyeballs.
An impossible choice loomed. Leave their home or risk tempting the floodwaters each spring.
We loved this house. We couldn't imagine it being torn down.
Their solution? Lift the house from its foundation and move it a few miles deeper into Minnesota, beyond the claws of the Red River.
The house movers came and they told us that, everything could stay in the house when they were going to move it.
They said, well, how high do you want your house, your foundation? I said, come here, I'll show you. I put a pole in the ground where the high water mark was. I want to be 8 feet higher than this point. So now the water runs away from us, and we're 8 feet higher than the big flood.
The rest of Sherlock Park wasn't so lucky. Trees and grass now pockmarked the land where the neighborhood stood.
All the homes around us were torn down. I think 4 or 5 homes in the neighborhood out of about 200 homes moved out of the neighborhood. That was very sad to watch.
A similar fate awaited Whitey's. After a rebuild and a brief resurgence, the restaurant closed for good in 2017.
I haven't even been down here. Let's go in these offices once. As you come in here to the office, desk is completely turned over, and all the chairs and everything in the office is completely gone. Unreal. Estimate is over $1 million to fix it up, so we certainly have to look at building a new building. We closed the Sorley Bridge at 47 feet, but notice how the chart had 52 feet. We never even thought we'd dreamed that we'd get that high. We topped the charts, and like we said, we went right through the roof.
We'll never know what the impact was on people afterwards, because that was where stress and things happened. Became a life-changing event for most people, including myself personally, and a kind of defining time for the city of Grand Forks.
Where my house is, or was, is now a park.
If I want to load all my kids up and go for a walk down to Lincoln Drive, I can do that. It's not that far. I know exactly where I'm going. My boys are almost 9. It's just a park to them. We lost everything. We moved back into a flooded, gutted house out of desperation, pretty much. And yet it was one of the most fun summers I've ever had in my whole life.
I believe there is a greater force. I believe things happen for a reason, but I also believe it is how you deal with it and deal with the aftermath. I loved the house. I don't know if I necessarily miss the house.
As I think all of you know, I have just come from touring the devastation of the floods. It has been a very moving experience for all of us.
Today, towering flood walls stand guard around Grand Forks. Hulking metal doors are pushed into place each spring, caging the mighty river. Downtown has largely been rebuilt. Massive floodwaters, like those in 1997, could now be corralled.
You already think that you've prepared for the worst and you hope for the best, but what really is the worst? And we thought it would be our normal major flood in that upper 40s level.
We have hardly ever seen such a remarkable demonstration of courage and commitment and cooperation. The next few days are going to be very, very hard on a lot of people. A lot of you who've been very, very brave and courageous and helped your friends and neighbors it's going to sink in on you what you have been through and what has been lost.
Had we known, we would have evacuated the city first, then come back and fought the flood. I think it taught us a lot of lessons to be prepared personally and professionally.
Be good to yourselves. Understand you don't have to be ashamed if you're heartbroken. You can rebuild stronger and better than ever.
We don't try to shock people. When you start looking back, we see that there's some very bad flood years in the late 1800s, and certainly earlier than that have occurred throughout this basin.
I will never forget what I have seen and heard here. I have seen the pictures of people battling the flames of the fire in the rising floods. I have seen rescue workers working around the clock even as they lost their own homes. And no matter what you have lost in this terrible flood, what you have saved and strengthened and sharpened and shown to the world is infinitely better. And you should be very, very proud of it.
One day, experts believe that even these walls won't be enough to tame the wild red. But for now, a memorial marks the floodwaters at 54 feet, acknowledging the strength of a community and the depth of the waters during the Red River flood.